I would like to start by thanking RMAG for hosting me, and especially Debbie and Kathy and Jesse and Pete. They've been super helpful in not only organizing this, but marketing it, which is why we had so many people at this talk. So today we'll be talking about sediment-hosted vanadium and uranium exploration, and hopefully you guys will get something useful out of this. So the plan is we're going to talk about the history of uranium and vanadium exploration and ask ourselves, is uranium even relevant in the year 2021? We'll talk about how companies are currently exploring for uranium and vanadium in ancient sedimentary successions, and how we can use sedimentology to improve these workflows. We will also talk about quite a few of these miners principles that have been around for a long time. And these are super important because not only are they being used for exploration of uranium and vanadium on the Colorado Plateau, folks around the globe use the Colorado Plateau as a template for exploration in their own basins. And in the end, of course, we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So let's talk about the history of uranium. I wish I could find a graph that showed, that went further back than 1968, but this is the best one I could find. Now, unlike the price of oil, which largely depends on how someone in Saudi or Russia happens to feel that particular day, the price of uranium depends largely on the public opinion of uranium. That's super important. The other thing the price of uranium depends on, besides supply, is mine closures. So if you take a look right here, this is the heyday of uranium right here. So this is in the late 1970s, and then 3 Mile Island happened, and of course, like I said, public opinion matters quite a bit. So you can see there's this huge plunge in uranium prices, and then of course Chernobyl happened, and then things just got really bad. And as if they weren't bad enough, Kazakhstan starts producing uranium, and Kazakhstan is to uranium what Saudi Arabia is to oil. Okay, they have the world's largest reserves, and they are producing tons of uranium. They have flooded the market, and as a result, uranium prices plummeted, making much of the uranium on the Colorado Plateau uneconomic. Now you can see that a series of mine closures, these are mostly up in Canada. Canada is another very large producer of uranium. A lot of those mine closures led to a temporary peak in uranium price in 2007. And then again, they plummeted as soon as these mines came back online. And then Fukushima happened. And then again, so bottom line is uranium isn't doing too hot. Okay. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because if we put the evolution of our understanding of fluvial sedimentology and stratigraphy over the past 40 years, you can see that a lot of these ideas that seem super normal right now weren't even around back then. Okay, for example, I remember being a graduate TA at Colorado State, and we were teaching undergrads Andrew Miles' architectural element analysis. So we take these things for granted, but you have to keep in mind that they haven't been around for too long. So the last uranium boom happened before Miles came out with his architectural element analysis, before John Bridge came out with this whole idea of correlating using scaling relationships. If you're not familiar with scaling relationships, this is using the thicknesses of bed forms, and you plug those numbers into a bunch of different equations. And then it gives you the sinuosity. You can predict the channel depth, the individual channel width, channel belt width. Again, none of these ideas were around back in the early 1970s. The relationship between taphonomy and paleosols. Taphonomy, again, if you're not familiar with the term, is the science of preservation of plant and animal fossils. Okay, and hopefully by the end of this talk, you will realize that plant taphonomy is super important when it comes to the exploration of uranium. Then large public fluvial databases that relate with the thickness ratios, such as Martin Gimling's fluvial database. That wasn't around. We had no idea what counterpoint bars were back in the early 1970s. And then the latest ideas of distributary fluvial systems, and then Chris Fielding's latest classification of fluvial systems based on discharge variability. None of these ideas are around. So when I'm giving this talk, what I don't want you to think is, what Ali is saying, he is a lot smarter than the folks that have devoted their entire careers to uranium and vanadium exploration back in the 1970s and 80s. Now, that is not true at all. In fact, those are my mentors, and I have tons and tons of respect for them. They have an encyclopedic knowledge of this area, and I mean they're fantastic. But again, you have to remember that they were doing the best that they could at the time, which was the last uranium boom in the late 1970s, before a lot of these major ideas came around. So since a lot of these ideas have come around, it would only make sense to incorporate them. Now, again, like I said, unfortunately, I couldn't find a graph that went back further in time than the 1960s. But what you should know is about the Manhattan Project, which was in the 1940s. This is during World War II. There was a nuclear arms race between the US, Japan, and Germany. And the reason the US was successful is because they had access to uranium ore that the Germans and the Japanese did not. Okay? And how is that? Well, not only were we producing uranium in the US had control of mines in the DRC, which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is where this cool looking image coming from. And there's not a picture I took, this is from Wikipedia, but the rest of the pictures you'll see in the talk are all mine. But at one point during its heyday, they were literally shipping 400 tons of uranium to the US, to Staten Island, every month. So just imagine all that stuff sailing across the Atlantic on those ships to the US. So we talked a bit about uranium. Let's talk about vanadium. This is a very different story here. Vanadium consumption has actually gone up over time. Why is that? Well, it's used in a lot of different things. It's used in batteries, it's used in ceramics, it's used in glass. It is also used to reinforce steel. So when you're talking about developing countries like China and India, where there is tons of construction going on, there is a very large demand for uranium. Okay? So that is definitely something to keep in mind. So the story of vanadium is very different. Then why are we talking about both? Why are we lumping vanadium and uranium exploration into one? Well, I'll tell you what. The reason we're doing that is because on the Colorado Plateau, they occur together, okay, in the same successions. Oftentimes, they are in the same ore body. And the ratios of vanadium to uranium are ridiculously high. They range anywhere between 10 to 1 to 40 to 1. Which is why we are talking about them together in this talk. So speaking of the Colorado Plateau, if you are not from the US and you're looking at this talk, the Colorado Plateau is not just the state of Colorado, it is the states of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. We lump them together, not just because it is the same plateau, it has roughly the same elevation, but it has generally the same stratigraphy. So a lot of these formation names that I'm going to talk about are found throughout these 4 states, okay? And what you're looking at on this map is also the number of mines. So when you're looking at the color red, we're talking about greater than 1,000 mines. So a lot of the photos that you'll be seeing today, most of them are from Colorado, Utah, and then there's a few from New Mexico. So this is work that I have been doing for the past year and a half at this point. And the list that you're seeing here, this is the who's who of the uranium world. So this would be like me talking to a deepwater sedimentologist and telling them that I've been to outcrops in Ainsa in Spain. I have been to the Ross Sandstone in Ireland. I've been to the Karoo Basin in South Africa. I've been to the Brushy Canyon in the US. So whoever hears that is like, whoa, this guy, He has hit up pretty much every important deep water outcrop. So that's what I've essentially done. It's been so over 100 days spent out in the field visiting mines. Now, what I've done is in this particular talk, I'm going to talk specifically about fluvial deposits. So we're going to talk about the saltwash member of the Morrison. That's most of the pictures you're going to see. And then there's quite a few examples from the Triassic Shinle Formation as well. But if you are interested in uranium in carbonates or in shallow marine sandstones, then what you should probably do is if you just Google sediment-hosted uranium exploration, there's a talk that I did for SME and the Energy Mineral Division of the APG. This was last year. That talk is on YouTube, and if you're interested in carbonates, shallow marine successions, I would recommend you go check that out. Okay, so the plan today is fluvial only. So what are companies doing? How are companies still approaching this? Well, believe it or not, even with the low prices of uranium right now, there are companies actively exploring for uranium in the Western US. And ironically, most of these companies are actually Australian. Okay, so they come out here and they're doing the work. And then, of course, the uranium gets shipped back to Australia. So how are they doing this? Well, here is a press release. This was done about a month ago. This was done in March. And when it comes to the geology, this is their description. It says uranium and vanadium mineralization are hosted in Jurassic Age sandstones, which is the Morrison. These deposits are known to be elliptical and tabular in shape. So, I mean, and not to come down hard on these guys, but if I send an email to Chris Fielding or Brian Willis, and that was the terminology that I used to describe these ore bodies in fluvial settings, they'd come down and beat me up. Okay, so this is far from the technological and scientific advancements that we've made in fluvial set strat. And so hopefully by the end of this talk, I can convince you that developing a thorough understanding of the sedimentology of these deposits is really going to help in exploration. And then here's just a pretty picture just to show you what vanadium looks like in outcrop. Okay. So there's been a paradigm shift in mining. Until 10 to 20 years ago, people used type models like Carlin type gold deposits. Okay, or Central African copper belt type deposits. Well, they've moved away from that. What they're doing now is the mineral systems approach. It's very similar to the petroleum systems approach in the sense that they're looking at a source, they're looking at migration pathways, they're looking for traps. So I'll just summarize this for you real quick. Basic idea is for you to be able to transport these metals, what you need are oxidizing fluids, and you need a source of vanadium and uranium. Now, the source of most of the uranium and vanadium in these areas, when I say in these areas, we're talking about the US, we're talking about felsic granites or volcanic asphalt tuffs. Okay, these are a huge deal, especially for deposits like the Glass Hills up in Wyoming. Now, migration pathways can vary, but basically they're going through permeable sandstones, and they'll keep on going until they hit some sort of reductant. And at that redox cline is where you get uranium and vanadium deposition. Okay, so how do folks capitalize on this idea? Well, I'm sure most of you have heard of this concept of a classic roll front, and that's what this cartoon is showing. This was a slide given to me by Michael Campbell, who is the president of the uranium part for APG's Energy Mineral Division. He was nice enough to share these with me. There's a picture that he took. But how are they doing this? So here's the idea. Oxidizing fluids carrying uranium are migrating from left to right, and they keep going until they hit a reductant, and then you get this transition. Okay, you get a transition from it being totally oxidized on the left to being totally reduced on the right. And in the middle, you get this feature called a roll front. Now, they've drilled a bunch of wells here, which is what the uranium folks do. They drill a lot of wells. These are super shallow wells, and then they run gamma ray logs in there and PFN logs. And by looking at the gamma ray signature, you can kind of get a sense of where you are along this roll front. And once they've found it, then the next step is some sort of in situ leach, which means they're going to drill a series of injection and production wells. The fluids go through, they dissolve the uranium, and then they go up into the production wells. Okay, and here's another, and now in this picture, they're showing you the colors of the cuttings that they're using. So this works out pretty well. Okay, but again, you should remember that not all uranium deposits are roll fronts. So what do you do in a place like the Colorado Plateau where they're not that common? Well, then over the years, miners have come up with their own principles. So we're going to go through these principles, and I'm going to give you some sedimentological context as to why these actually work. Okay, so one of the principles is go look for channel lags. If you're going to find channel lags, that's where we usually find uranium and vanadium, in these pebbles. And you can see that here's an example of a lag. This is from, let's see, this is from the Slick Rock district, okay, along the Colorado-Utah border. And the colors that you're seeing, the yellow is carnotite, the dark blue is azurite. So the same principles generally work for sediment-hosted copper as well. So these pebbles are super enriched. So what's the deal? Why are we getting uranium and vanadium deposition along these pebbles? So the first thing you need to know, it can't just be any sort of pebbles sitting at the base of channels. That's not what we're talking about. For example, here's a picture of the Morrison Formation from Rabbit Valley. Fantastic place to collect dinosaur bones. And if you're looking at the mudstones down here, those are super red. So yeah, you could incorporate as many of those into the base of the channel. And no, you're not going to get any uranium deposition there. Why? Because there's very little organics in there. Okay, so when we're looking for pebbles, we are looking for channels that are incising into organic rich matrix, okay, or I should say organic rich substrates. So you would get the pebbles at the base. Another area which would be good are the tops of the bars. So if you're looking at this channel, here's the scoured base, here's the bed load sheet. You can see some cross beds in here. These represent the unit bar, and of course there's the bar top. Now on top of the bars, you would probably have some sort of vegetation. And I've seen several zones where you have a paleosol zone, lots of rhizoconcretions, and they're all uranium mineralized. So good place for uranium: channel base, channel top, not so much in the middle of the channel. Here's an example of a bar top. The dark purplish color that you're seeing, that is all vanadium. Okay, you can see that these are some lower flow regime plain beds representing the bar top, and that's where we're getting vanadium. Now here's the problem. The problem is, if you know anything about fluvial set strat, you know that one channel cuts into another, and when that happens, the preservation potential of bar tops is fairly slim. Okay, because that's the first facies to get eroded. The second problem is that yes, you could get the lowermost channel cutting into the mudstones, which are organic rich, which is kind of what you're seeing over here. Here's the base of the channel. Here's the organic rich siltstones with the uranium mineralization in there. But if you keep repeating this process, so one channel cuts into another one, and another one, and another one, and you're getting this aggradational pattern of stacking, which we call multi-story stacking, the probability of you getting lags up in the upper channels is fairly slim because you're just recycling sand. Okay, so this is not what we want. And there's a big difference from oil and gas. In oil and gas, we love vertical connectivity of our fluvial sand bodies. So if you're getting multi-story channels, that's a beautiful thing. But if you're looking for uranium, well, you want those lags. And because you want those lags, instead of getting multi-story stacking, vertical stacking, you need to get multilateral stacking so you can preserve more of those lags right at the base of this channel body. Okay. Now, what controls the stacking? There's a few different factors. One of those is channel mobility. It depends on avulsion. It depends on how much reoccupation you're getting. If it's fairly local avulsion, you get a lot of reoccupation of the same channel and they keep stacking vertically. If you are getting what's called regional avulsion, then you tend to get compensation stacking or you get multilateral stacking. All right, a lot of work has been done on what controls these channel stacking patterns. In fact, people have done work specifically on the Morrison. And I have to remember, we're talking about the Morrison Formation. This is, in my opinion, it's one of the best studied and the most well-exposed fluvial successions in the world. So a lot of folks have worked at. So here's some channel styles that folks have found in there. So they've found some of these steerhead channels. So these are isolated channels. Then you've got VABC, those are vertically accreting braided channels. Okay, so those would be the multi-story channels I talked to you about. Not very conducive to preserving those lags. They're super thick, but they're not very rich in uranium or vanadium. Then we've got the laterally amalgamating braided channels, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a lot of this basal area that contains those logs, and that's what we're going for. And here's an example. This is just an isolated channel in a crevasse blade, and this picture was taken in the Slick Rock mining district very close to the town of Nasarita in Colorado. There's my dad for scale. So what is some of the best uranium producing mining districts have in common? Well, if you're driving towards Slick Rock, well, one of the things you notice is everything's just very organic rich, and then you get there and you see these stacked avulsion deposits. Okay, so you see a lot of this avulsion. This is from the Slick Rock mining district. Here's the big one. This is the Grants mining district down in New Mexico. And this has produced tons of uranium. In fact, Grants used to be called the uranium capital of the world. Unfortunately, after the uranium boom, it became the crystal meth capital of the world. It's a super high crime rate down there now. But outcrops are still cool. Avulsion deposits down here until the channel has established itself. Okay, so am I the first one ever identifying these? No, they have been identified in the past, except what folks have done is classic lithostratigraphy. In fact, there's an entire volume that the USGS published on this stuff, where they would see something like this and we're like, okay, we're going to call this a different member name, and then this is a different member name, and and they came up with a lot of cool names. But what they didn't do is figure out what this actually meant from a genetic perspective and how that could be used to predict uranium occurrence. All right. So another mining principle is, well, we hardly ever found any uranium in channels thicker than 60 feet. Okay. Well, why is that? Well, I just told you, because when you get vertical stacking, you're just not preserving those lags. Okay. So we don't want super thick vertically accreting channel bodies. We want laterally accreting channel bodies that are thinner, but they have a lot more of these lags preserved. Again, the dark sooty looking stuff you're seeing, that's vanadium. The yellow that you're seeing, that is uranium in this picture from Utah. Now, here's another principle, which is it's got to be a 50-50 sand shale ratio. Well, personally, I don't like to call the fine-grained component of fluvial systems shale. Just call those mudstones and claystones, but you can see what they're talking about. Here's a picture taken very close to the town of Uraban, which was tons of uranium was found there. Here's the mine. You can see here's some tailings right there. Right above the Entrada, there's the Morrison, and what do you see? Well, you do see a 50-50 net to gross. Here's some channels right there. Then there's some mudstones, more channels, more mudstones, and then there's a capping channel belt on top. Okay, well, why is this? What's the science behind this? Well, we gotta look at some of the stuff that a lot of the folks in the UK have been working on, which are distributary fluvial systems. I know there's folks that would argue, they're like, oh, this DFSs are the same thing as fluvial megafans, and we've known about them for years. And that's true to a certain extent, but we're going to talk about their contribution here. So what are these? Well, they're not alluvial fans, but they are point sourced. They are super common in foreland basin settings, and that's what the Morrison Formation is. It is a DFS. Okay, now the Morrison was deposited over a period of around 7 million years. So of course, climate changes. It's going from being arid to semi-arid to seasonal to humid, and all those changes are reflected in fluvial style for fluvial architecture. So is the Shinle. The Shinle is also a DFS, except that the climate is a little bit different. So how can we possibly use these? Well, here's the deal. You get to the apex, the point source of the system, and all the sand bodies are connected. Okay, if all the sand bodies are connected, what is the source of the uranium? Well, in this particular case, the source of the uranium happens to be volcanic asphalt tuffs that are preserved in the mudstones between the channels. Well, if you do this, well, guess what? All that stuff's gone. Okay, so you're not preserving any of those asphalt tuffs. And if you're not going to preserve it, what's going to source the uranium? So you just don't have the source here. Okay, you get over here and it's like this perfect Goldilocks syndrome. All right, so you've got the asphalt tuffs preserved in the paleosols between these channel belts, and that's right in the middle of the system. And then you go distal, and now, yeah, you're preserving a lot more of the overbanks that contain those, that preserve those asphalt tuffs. But guess what? Now there's almost no channels in there. Or the few channels that are in there are super isolated, so they're not well connected enough to provide this high permeability highway for oxidizing fluids to go through. Okay, so this is what we're looking for. Here's an example of what this looks like in outcrop. These are photos from Amanda Owen's publications. She did her PhD out here on the Morrison, specifically on the salt wash. And you can see that the proximal part, everything's super well connected, high net to gross, or if you like to call it, high channel deposit proportion. Here we're 50-50. Here we're pretty darn low. Now what Amanda did is her and Adrian Hartley went a step further, and they're like, okay, let's put some of these uranium mines on there. And when they did, they realized that they really do all map out right at that 50% contour line. So how is this important? Well, this is super important because if you're going to explore for uranium, and if you can map out these DFS, well, then you can predict the occurrence of where you're going to find uranium and vanadium. Okay, this is super important. Okay, so this is one example of how we can use good sedimentology and stratigraphy to be predictive. Now here's another one. Go for the sandstones right above the green-gray mudstones. Well, guess what? A lot of these mudstones didn't start off being green and gray. They became green and gray because they got waterlogged. Well, why would they get waterlogged? Well, they get waterlogged because in the distal portions of these DFS, you had a lot of lakes, high, especially when you have high water table. That's when these things go gray and green. Another miner's principle is look for petrified wood. So why are we looking for petrified wood? Well, again, remember, you need a reductant. You need a reductant for deposition. This picture was taken at Happy Jack Mine, gigantic mine in Utah. This is the White Canyon area, and all you see in the back are just organic rich mudstones, and then you see some overbank sandstones. So what's going on here? This is super important. All right, so a lot of the folks, Greg Rotalik was one of the first who related plant taphonomy and vertebrate taphonomy to EHPH. Okay, so what he figured out was that if you're looking at fluvial sediments, which is this line that I've drawn for you, you need certain conditions to preserve bone, and then you need a completely different set of conditions to preserve plant-rich material. Okay? So to preserve plant-rich material, you need to be in this part of this EHPH diagram. Okay? So we need reducing conditions to preserve plant matter. High acidity is good. Okay, high acidity is not a problem. It's a problem if you're trying to preserve bone, but it's not a problem if you're trying to preserve plant matter. So where would we get conditions like this? Okay, well, that's the first thing to think about. The second thing we have to think about is if plant accumulations are providing entrapment for uranium and vanadium, where are these plants? Where is this organic rich detritus most likely to be preserved. Now, Tim Demko did a lot of work on this, and he basically classified this into 3 different types. He talks about allochthonous, which are things that have been transported, but very little, okay? So, or actually a lot, so greater than 500 meters in this case, you know, like things like logs along basal lags. I found these to be super common, and in fact, I would argue that the only time you are going to get a uranium accumulation or a vanadium accumulation, which is economic in a large channel body, is if you've got a log jam. Okay, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. Then there's autochthonous, which are things in place. Unfortunately, this I've never seen, but you know, Tim Demko obviously has. Then there's para-autochthonous. So these are things that have been transported, but not much. Okay, so these are things like leaves in splay deposits. Again, these are things that I found super common. In fact, they're so common in uranium mines that the folks that used to work these used to call that organic trash. Okay, so here's an example. This is from the Shinley Formation. Here's the log, part of a log jam. The green that you're seeing is copper. And if you zoom in on this part, right on the tree trunk, there's your carnotite. Okay, so there's your uranium right there. And the reason why it's looking purple is because of the vanadium. All right. Now, the rest of the world, based off of the Colorado Plateau model, believes that the only place you find uranium is large channels. And I'm going to tell you right now, that is not true. The only time you are going to find uranium in channels is if you have a log jam. Okay, I know a lot of people may not agree, but that's my observations based on a year and a half of spending time out there looking at over 50 different mines, close to 100 mines at this point. So if you can find a mine where the uranium is in the channel thalweg and there's no evidence of disseminated organics or log jams in there, you got to give me a call. All right, so here's another example. This is right outside Gateway in southern Colorado by the Utah border. And what I want you to look at before you focus on the yellow carnotite up there is look at this bedding right here. That is IHS, that's inclined hydrolithic stratification. That is not in the channel, that is the point bar. Okay, so that's lateral accretion. Now, if you've ever been to a point bar right after the river flood, what do you see on top of the point bar? Well, you see a bunch of organic detritus, including tons of leaves. It's a whole bunch of leaf litter because why? Because organic particles, plant detritus, has the same settling velocity as silt. Okay, so this is the last thing to settle out of suspension, okay, during waning flows. So right here is a whole bunch of leaf litter, and in that leaf litter, you're finding all that uranium. Now, like I said, folks used to call it trash. I think that's a horrible term for it, but you know, what can you do? Here's another example. So you think about it this way. If you are looking at a fluvial system, where are you most likely to get lower settling velocities? Not in the channel thalweg, that's the fastest. Those are the highest velocities, okay? So here's some overbank deposits. You can see aggregating ripples, and the purple that you see, that is vanadium. Here's another example. Aggregating ripples. The green that you see is tellurite, which is another mineral that contains uranium. The darker stuff that you see, okay, that's more vanadium right there. Again, overbank setting, not in channels. That's my scintillometer for scale. So another common idea that people have, and this is for not just uranium miners, but you know, the general public, is, oh, dinosaur bones. You know, you find accumulations of dinosaur bones, you're going to find uranium. Now, that is partially correct, okay? Yes, you will find uranium in the dinosaur bones, and back in the day, these guys literally, and I've seen this, I've been to places near the Colorado National Monument where you can see there was a gigantic sauropod bone that someone had excavated, and there's pieces of carnotite all over the place. So the bone was super enriched in uranium, and then they dug out the whole thing. And yes, back in the day, they used to send trucks full to the mill, which is a paleontological disaster, but you know, what can you do? So why are the dinosaur bones enriched in uranium, and are they a vector to look for uranium in the rocks? Well, the reason they're full of uranium is because hydroxyapatite, which is what bones are made up of, that is easily replaced by some of these uranium minerals, okay? But just because the bone itself is uranium mineralized, that does not mean that the host rock is also going to be uranium mineralized. In fact, the conditions for preservation of dinosaur bone, those are not the same conditions that preserve organic matter, like plants, which provide the larger reductant accumulations of reductant where uranium and vanadium deposition takes place. So yeah, this one not so much. Okay. Now here's the big difference. This was last year. There's a guy on LinkedIn. I sent him an email, and he was posting a lot of uranium pictures from the Colorado Plateau. So I shoot him an email. I'm like, hey, I've been doing field work in the Morrison, not just the Morrison, but fluvial successions across the globe. I can describe your core for you. And which is radio silence. Like this guy, had the deer caught in the headlights sort of look like, why on earth would I want to do anything with sedimentology and core description if I'm looking for uranium? It was just this super funky idea. So here's the deal. They do take core in the US. They just don't slab it. Okay? So these uranium companies will take core. Why are they taking the core if they're not going to slab it or if they're not going to do any sedimentology? Well, they're taking the core because some guy is going to take a handheld XRF and they're going to just run it along the core, and they're just trying to get parts per million of uranium. Okay, that's all they're doing. So they're just trying to establish grade using core. They're not doing any set strat with it. But guess who does that? The Australians do. So this is from a publication, and here they slab the core and they related. You can see a whole bunch of this, all this dark colors is vanadium. They related the vanadium occurrence to set strat. Okay, and this is super important. And if you are listening to this, and if you are working for a uranium company or a vanadium company in the US, you got to slab your core. You got to have a sedimentologist look at your core. This is standard practice in the oil and gas industry, and there's a reason why you do this. You miss out on all the details if the stuff is not slabbed. So, lessons learned today is that basin scale alluvial architecture can be used to predict uranium vanadium occurrence. This is super important. I showed you an example. I showed you some examples of that, mainly from Amanda Owen and Adrian Hartley's work. Single story channels and multilateral channels are much more attractive than multi-story channels just because of preservation potential of those organic rich lags. Overbank sandstones definitely make better targets than channel thallic sandstones. Okay, so again, think about settling velocity of organic detritus. And the key to finding large sediment-hosted uranium vanadium deposits is you have to understand the controlling parameters on organic detritus preservation. Okay, I'm going to leave you guys with this beautiful pteropod footprint from one of the mines in Utah.